I want to tell you a story. It will change your understanding of simple things. One day, on a quiet autumn afternoon, I saw a man standing by the roadside staring into an old, cracked mirror. He didn't move, didn't speak, just looked. And you know what was strange? The mirror didn't reflect his face, but something entirely different. A shadow, a silhouette that moved as if it had a life of its own. This story began just like that, with a simple glance into a reflection that decided to tell the truth. Thus begins our journey. Imagine a small village lost among the hills. There lived a man named Ivan. He was 40 years old and had worked his entire life, from morning till night, without rest. His hands were rough like the bark of an old oak, and his back was hunched from labor. He repaired carts, hauled sacks of grain, helped neighbors. But he never had money. It slipped through his fingers like water, leaving only exhaustion and emptiness. Ivan didn't complain. He told himself, "This is how everyone lives. You work to live, and you live to work." But one day he found that mirror on the road, old in a wooden frame with a crack down the middle. It lay by the roadside as if someone had discarded it on purpose. Ivan picked it up, wiped the dust off with his sleeve, and looked inside. And this is what he saw. Not his face, but a shadow. It moved, whispered, pointed somewhere far off. Ivan froze. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The shadow didn't answer, but its gesture was clear. "Follow me." "You see, my friends," I'd say to you, as if by a fireplace, we all find mirrors on our path. Sometimes it's a friend's words, sometimes a random book, and sometimes just silence that suddenly speaks. Ivan didn't know that the shadow in the mirror was his own soul, the part of him tired of staying silent. We often fear such encounters because they force us to look deeper than we're used to. Days passed, but Ivan couldn't forget what he'd seen. He began to notice how his neighbors mirrored his life. They worked, grew tired, counted their pennies, then worked again. An old man once told him, 95 out of 100 live like this, Ivan. It's the law of nature." But Ivan wondered, why? Why couldn't he, like them, break free? He started carrying the mirror with him, hiding it under his shirt. Every evening, alone, he looked into it. The shadow grew clearer, its movements more confident. It called him somewhere, but he didn't know where. When we ask questions, I'd whisper to you, the world begins to answer. Not right away, not loudly, but it answers. Ivan didn't yet know that his question was the first step. Thoughts are seeds, and they sprout even if we don't see the shoots. Then one night, with the moon hanging low over the hills, the shadow in the mirror spoke. Its voice was quiet, like the rustle of leaves. "You live as you were taught to live. But who wrote that lesson?" Ivan flinched. He'd never thought about it. He'd been taught to work, to endure, to not dream of more. But who decided that was right? The shadow vanished, leaving him with a question that burned hotter than fire. Imagine a house with no windows. You live in it your whole life, and they tell you that's how it should be. You believe it because you don't know any different. But one day you find a crack in the wall and light seeps through. What do? Patch it up or start breaking the wall? This story is about such a crack, and it began with the question the shadow left Ivan. Ivan became different. He still worked, but now his eyes searched for answers. He looked at the people around him, the blacksmith bending horseshoes, the miller grinding flour, the old woman selling eggs. They all lived like him, day after day, without change. But now he noticed what he hadn't before. Their faces were empty, not from sorrow or anger, but from habit. They expected nothing new. One day he asked the miller, "Have you ever wanted to leave this place, do something of your own?" The miller laughed. "Why? Here's my mill, my work. I have everything I need." Ivan nodded, but something tightened inside him. He recalled the shadow's words. Who wrote that lesson? The miller lived as he'd been taught, by his father, his grandfather, the village. But was it his choice? We often take others' rules for our own. I'd say to you softly, they come to us from childhood, like an old coat we wear even when it no longer fits. Ivan began to see this coat on everyone around him, but to take it off means standing naked before the unknown, and that's frightening. He started noticing how his own thoughts echoed old lessons. Money is hard, he told himself when counting coppers. Dreaming is pointless, he thought, watching the sunset. But the shadow in the mirror wouldn't let him rest. It appeared every night, whispering, "You only see what you've been shown. Look further." Ivan began to wonder, what if he wasn't just a worker? What if he could do more? One day, he went to an old woman who lived at the edge of the village. Her name was Marfa, and she was known for her wisdom. He asked, "Why do we all live so poorly? There's plenty of work, but little reward." Marfa looked at him with a long gaze and said, "Because you think poverty is your fate, but it's just a habit." Ivan frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked. Marfa smiled. "Tell me, how much do you want to earn tomorrow?" Ivan faltered. He'd never thought about how much, he just worked. "My friends," I'd add, "we rarely ask ourselves such questions. How much? Why? Where to? We walk the road we've been pointed to and don't ask if it leads where we need to go." Ivan faced this for the first time and his mind trembled. That night, the shadow in the mirror showed him a strange image, himself, but different, with a straight back, a smile, and a sack of gold in his hands. Ivan stared, unbelieving. "That's not me," he whispered. The shadow replied, "That's you as you could be, but you've built a house with no windows and live in it." Ivan woke in a cold sweat. For the first time, he understood. His poverty wasn't in his purse, but in his head. Do you know how a plant breaks through stone? It doesn't shatter it with force. It finds a crack, sends a root, and slowly, day by day, splits the boulder apart. This part of the story is about such a seed. It had already taken root in Ivan's soul, but he didn't yet know what would grow from it. Ivan began to change. He started asking himself questions he'd once avoided. How much did he want? What did he want? He looked at his hands and thought, they know how to work, but for what? He looked at his neighbors and asked himself, why don't they seek more? His mind, like a river after rain, churned and sought an outlet. One day, he decided to try. He took a cart he'd repaired for a neighbor and instead of handing it over for a copper coin, said, "Give me 2 sacks of grain." The neighbor was surprised. "Why so much?" Ivan replied, "I want to sell it at the market." The neighbor shrugged and agreed. Ivan went to town, sold the grain, and returned with money, more than he earned in a week. He stared at the coins, incredulous. It was so simple. Simplicity is life's great secret, I'd tell you. We complicate it because we're afraid to believe things could be different. Ivan took a step small as a seed, but that step began to change his world. He started noticing opportunities. Before, he saw only work, hard, familiar. Now he saw that work could be different. He repaired carts and offered to sell them. He took grain and hauled it to town. Money began to come, not a river, but a trickle. But more importantly, he began to think. If I can do this, what else can I do? He asked himself. The shadow in the mirror stayed silent, but its presence was felt. It watched as Ivan tried, stumbled, learned. One day he lost everything he'd earned. The cart broke on the road, the grain got soaked in the rain. He sat by the river, staring at the water, thinking it was all for nothing. But then he remembered Marfa's words, "Poverty is a habit." He stood, wiped his face, and went home. The next day, he started again. "My friends," I'd whisper, "falls don't mean the end. They teach us to rise." Ivan didn't realize it right away, but his seed had taken root. It grew even when he couldn't see it. Then one day, looking into the mirror, he noticed a change. The shadow was no longer vague. It resembled him, the Ivan standing with a sack of gold. But now he smiled differently, not from wealth, but from strength. The shadow said, "You've started breaking the stone. Don't stop." Ivan nodded. He understood his life wasn't fate, but choice. Sometimes we fear our shadows because they show us what we hide. But what if the shadow isn't an enemy, but a teacher? In this part of the story, Ivan began to dance with his shadow, and that dance changed everything. Ivan became a man people noticed. He no longer just repaired carts, he bought them, fixed them, and sold them. He hauled grain, fabric, tools, money flowed to him, and for the first time in his life, he could set some aside. But with money came eyes. Neighbors whispered, "Where's he getting this? He's one of us." Some envied, some asked for help. Ivan helped, but not everyone. He began to see that not all wanted to climb out like he did. People love their chains, I'd say to you gently. They complain about them, but hold on tight. Ivan saw this and his heart ached. He wanted to shout, "Look, anything is possible." But he knew Everyone must find their own mirror. One day the miller came to him. "Teach me," he said. "I see how you live. I want that too." Ivan smiled and asked, "How much do you want to earn?" The miller hesitated just as Ivan once had. "I don't know," he replied. Ivan nodded. "Until you know, nothing will change." The miller left and Ivan reflected. He realized it wasn't about money but desire. He wanted and began, but them? The shadow in the mirror became his companion. It no longer frightened him but inspired him. Every night he looked at it and asked, "What's next?" The shadow showed images, fields, houses, people working together. Ivan began to dream. He bought land, built a barn, hired helpers. His life grew bigger than the village. "Dreams are wings," I'd whisper to you, "but to fly, you must believe you have them." Ivan learned this step by step, and the shadow guided him like a star. But one night, the shadow showed him something else. He saw himself, rich but alone. Neighbors turned away, friends vanished. He stood in a big house, but it was empty. Ivan woke with a heaviness in his chest. "What does this mean?" he asked the mirror. The shadow replied, "You're building wealth, but forgetting why." Ivan froze. He realized he'd gotten so caught up that he'd lost something important. Wealth without meaning is like a house without a fire. It can be big, beautiful, but cold inside. This part of the story is about how Ivan faced this truth and understood that his journey wasn't over. Ivan became a wealthy man. He had barns, carts, workers. He could buy anything he wanted, warm clothes, good food, even a new house. But the more he had, the less he rejoiced. He looked at his neighbors and saw they were drifting away. Those who once invited him for tea now stayed silent. Those who asked for help now envied him. He went to Marfa. "Why is it like this?" he asked. She looked at him and said, "You've moved forward and they've stayed behind. You showed them life can be different, but they're not ready. That's their choice, not yours." Ivan pondered. "But why do I feel alone?" he asked. Marfa smiled. "Because you're building only for yourself, and a person doesn't live alone." My friends, I'd say to you, we often chase a goal, forgetting why we need it. Ivan achieved what he never dreamed of, but lost warmth. Wealth is a tool, not happiness. He began to understand this. He looked into the mirror less often. The shadow stayed silent, as if waiting for him to find the answer himself. One day he went to the village and saw a boy repairing an old cart. The boy worked as Ivan once had, doggedly, but without hope. Ivan approached and said, "Let me help." They fixed the cart together and the boy smiled. Ivan felt a warmth he'd been missing. He started helping. He taught the kids how to repair carts, showed them how to trade. He didn't just give money, he gave knowledge. The village began to come alive. People looked at him differently, not with envy, but with interest. Ivan realized wealth grows when you share it. Generosity isn't loss, but multiplication, I'd whisper to you. Ivan found this secret and his house began to fill with light. But one night, the shadow spoke again. It showed him a village, but different, bigger, bustling, with houses and roads. "You can do more," it said. Ivan frowned. He'd only just found peace and the shadow was calling him further. "Why?" he asked. The shadow replied, "Because you're not finished." Ivan understood his path wasn't an end, but a beginning. Each of us builds our own city. Sometimes it's a village, sometimes a whole world. But what matters is what we build it from, fear or dreams. This part of the story is about how Ivan chose dreams and saw their reflection. Ivan decided to go further. He took his money, his people, and went to the city. There he bought land, built workshops, and started trading not just grain, but everything his hands could make. He taught people to think like him, to ask questions, seek opportunities. His business grew like a tree that had taken root in stone. The village remained behind, but he didn't forget it. He returned, helped, built. People looked at him and said, "That's Ivan who was once like us." Some followed him, some stayed. He didn't judge them. He knew everyone chooses for themselves. Choice is our strength, I'd say to you quietly. Ivan understood this, and his life became a mirror for others. He didn't force or pull, he simply showed what's possible. The shadow in the mirror was now clear. It no longer whispered. It stood beside him like a friend. One night, Ivan asked, "Who are you?" The shadow replied, "I am your faith." the one that lived in you even when you couldn't see it. Ivan smiled. He realized everything he'd done began with a question, a small step, faith. Years passed. Ivan built not just a business, but a city, a place where people learned to dream. He grew older, but his eyes still sparkled. One day he gave the mirror to the boy who'd been fixing the cart years ago. "Look into it," he said, "and listen." The boy nodded, and Ivan walked away knowing his story would continue. My friends, I'd conclude by the fireplace, this story isn't about Ivan. It's about you. You too will find your mirror, your shadow, and when you do, ask yourself, who wrote my lesson? The answer will change everything.